Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we're going to begin with a pretty recent development, at least as far as it comes based on when I was actually recording this video. Project Veritas got suspended from Twitter, and they got suspended from Twitter for the reason being that they doxed someone, essentially, that they released private information about someone they were covering. When, in actuality, what they were doing was something that literally every single journalist has ever done. So, to give you full context on this particular incident, Project Veritas did a video expose recently of Facebook execs who were talking a lot about lots of things. And I think this guy in particular was talking about freezing comments containing hate speech was what this guy was talking about. And they confronted him in front of his house, in front of his residency. And then they asked him essentially about that. And that's what spurred this on, that particular video, which Twitter banned, and Twitter suspended them for it. However, this is a ridiculous thing because journalists do this all the time. All the time. Whether you're talking about paparazzi who do this with celebrities, or you're talking about investigative or reporters who are doing this with politicians and in more political contexts, whenever there is a public figure, in general, there is going to be a subset of reporters who are going to end up going to private residencies in order to try and get a story, in order to try and get a response to some question that they wouldn't have in any other environment. This is entirely normal. But Twitter has been treating a lot of journalism recently as being not normal. This comes just a few months after the whole Hunter Biden shebang that happened on Twitter, where they banned one of the oldest concurrently running newspapers, and I think suspended their account, the New York Post, for those who are unaware, because they posted a story of what is literally just normal investigative journalism. The sort of stuff you'd see anywhere. With lots, and that was a true story that was being reported essentially accurately, as we've discovered in the months hence. But because of how Twitter handled the situation, they greatly dropped the range of that reporting. And this has been something that Twitter's been doing for a while, but something that has always irked me about how Twitter does suspensions is that they, rather than deleting a post, sometimes, if you get suspended from Twitter, you'll get the option to be unsuspended if you delete the tweet. Which I always found to just be one of the most insipid ways of enforcing self-censorship that I've ever seen. Because what that sort of thing does, and what it tries to promote, is the idea that, we can forgive you if you just stop saying that. It's essentially a way of disavowing your own opinion, of your own thoughts, if it comes afoul of Twitter's own content policy, or more accurately, their moderators. And it's just always irked me. And I'm glad to see that a lot of people are unwilling to actually engage in such self-censorship as that. But it's just, man, it's kind of a, you might say, a acknowledgement from Twitter on Twitter's behalf that what you did wasn't even really wrong. Because if they really thought it was wrong, they'd just delete the tweets themselves, which they can do. They can delete tweets on their own. They don't need other people to do it. But they sometimes do this sort of thing, and I just, man, it's such an insipid practice, and it really needs to stop. I don't even understand how it came to be, necessarily. I don't know the history behind it, obviously. I haven't really looked into it, other than just knowing it's scummy. But it is an interesting thing that Twitter does. And that actually happened in this instance, where Twitter asked Veritas, please will you delete this tweet, though? If I ever got that sort of thing, not that I use Twitter all that often anymore, but if I ever got that sort of thing on one of my tweets, I would just, even if I were to delete the tweet, I'd just post it again, literally the exact same words. I literally just would. I think that's how I'd respond to it if I deigned to want my Twitter account back, which in all likelihood I wouldn't, because Twitter's a worthless platform that's just filled with echo chambers, and I think I explained that well enough yesterday, I think it was. So, to move on to our next story. Now, Biden has said that China will eat our lunch, which is a bit of a departure from what his previous rhetoric on this was, because if those of you who remember, Biden said just back in 2019 that China wasn't competition for them. And this sort of rhetoric, and other rhetoric that he was saying, that seems at least hard, and some of the people he's hiring seem to be, at least ostensibly are, tough on China types. In all these cases, it's a sort of dissonance that has been growing in the Biden administration. Because Biden is Beijing Biden. He is a guy who is mostly enthralled to China, who's someone who is not going to act against China in any way. This is perfectly exemplified by his removal of the transparency policy with regard to universities acknowledging their Chinese donors. And that sort of thing has been absolutely monolithic across Biden's policy. But what he's been doing over the past few weeks he's been cultivating an image of having a tough personality against China, at least in certain instances, and this is another one of those times where he's trying to cultivate the idea that he is somehow more tough on China than Trump is. This is, of course, entirely inaccurate, as I've already displayed multiple times, and through his policies and through what he wants, but if he actually was this way, what you'd immediately want to do, and what was kind of being proposed under Trump, though it didn't ever really get done, it started getting there, but it wasn't quite there yet, is what really needs to happen in a response to China, is you need to decouple the economies. We need to stop relying on Chinese manufacturing for goods. And people will scoff at this, but saying that, oh, we couldn't do that because America relies on Chinese manufacturing. We couldn't get it anywhere else. This is, of course, inaccurate, but I think the most poignant way to see exactly how perfect this sort of strategy would be is to see China react to even the slight mention of the idea of decoupling the economies. Because as soon as someone from China starts hearing about the idea that someone in America wants to decouple the economy, stop relying on Chinese manufacturing, they absolutely freak out. Which shouldn't be the case, considering that China is supposedly a competitive and hostile state to us. They should, in theory, want to not have anything to do with us. But the fact of the matter is, America doesn't really rely on China's economy. At least we don't inherently. But China absolutely does rely on America's economy for its continued existence. Because China has spent the last few decades, ever since Nixon opened them up, lying about their economic numbers to make them look as good as possible, to incentivize foreign investment, and trying to get as much manufacturing capacity into their borders as possible. The reason they've been doing this is they want to become the next economic superpower. I think that should be fairly obvious from anyone who's seen anything with regard to Chinese culture, or their policies or strategies, international strategies, and whatnot. It's obvious they want to become a superpower. And the way they're trying to do this is that they are trying to fake their economic numbers to have this meteoric rise, and then once they take the top spot, use the leverage of having the top spot to turn those fake numbers into real numbers. And that's kind of what they've been doing. They've been doing it sort of piecemeal as well, where they do have, and they have been cultivating, the real numbers behind the scenes while their fake numbers continue to exist and be pumped out to foreign investors who don't know any better. That's what the Chinese have been doing. But the problem with this strategy, and the reason that they are so scared of decoupling with the U.S. economy, is because China relies entirely on U.S. consumption and foreign consumption more broadly to have these sort of fake numbers be able to exist at all. And the reason for this is because all of this sort of stuff that they're producing, all of the things they produce, only have a market if they have almost a monopoly on foreign exportation. If they're exporting, and the U.S. is getting almost exclusively Chinese good, China is gaining a lot of stuff from that. They're getting a lot of money, and they're actually maintaining that demand, and that that supply is not going to waste. If, however, U.S. was to shift away from China, and I'm not saying to shift entirely to U.S. manufacturing, as that's not really possible, but rather shifting to another area where there is, where they are good at manufacturing and they do it quite cheaply. Maybe not quite as cheap as China, but of course, no one could really compete with someone who's faking their numbers that hard and are lowering their prices so systematically as China is. But say we were to move a lot of our manufacturing to somewhere like India, or somewhere like Taiwan, or Vietnam, or just a multitude of countries rather than just relying on a single one, China starts collapsing. And the reason they start collapsing is because they no longer have that U.S. consumption to create their economic momentum. They are relying on the U.S. for that economic momentum, and that's why they freak out so hard when you see the idea of decoupling be proposed. And for the record, those of you who are engaging, or engaging on more than just buying a single product on Amazon, if you're, say, thinking of making a merch store, selling t-shirts and that sort of thing, make sure that your manufacturing is at the very least not coming from China. I don't care if it's coming from the U.S., not really. But try at least make sure that it's not coming from China, because first of all, China's a hostile state. And second of all, China's economy is not stable, as the last year should have proven to everyone, and proven to almost every U.S. investor who knows anything and has, eyes. China's economy can stop on a whim. All right, that's what happened in February. When Wuhan locked down, when Chinese manufacturing suddenly stalled and completely stopped because they locked down their entire economy, that decimated certain companies. For instance, a industry that or a hobby that I'm particularly involved in that has a lot of its roots, its manufacturing roots in China, the actual VR industry, had a lot of problems, had a lot of stock problems because of specifically this. You couldn't get, say, a Valve Index for months at a time because this particular factory in Wuhan wasn't doing anything because the whole province was shut down. That's not a good sign for economic stability. It's not a good sign for a very good, supplier. That's not a good thing. So you need to diversify into other countries. It's something that needs to be done. And man, I kind of went off into the weeds there for a bit. And of course, that sort of stuff is not going to be done by the Biden administration. It is important to say that. And moving on to our next story, Florida is going to be targeted, at least partially, by the Biden administration. And the Biden administration is at least looking into the idea of limiting travel through Florida, like to and from Florida. Which, the explanation for this, I can't even fathom. I mean, presumably the idea would be, is that, we're going to limit travel because COVID. Problem with that is that Florida is not number one in cases in coronavirus, not by a per capita, and certainly not in raw numbers. They're actually 29th, I think, per capita. So that's not the problem. They're not near the top spot in deaths. I think they're also in the bottom half in that case. So what would be the reason for this to happen? Of course, this premise itself is unconstitutional, as such border restrictions between states in the United States would be inherently unconstitutional, as what the Constitution is based on is the idea that these states are all going to be one country. And thus, so these sorts of travel restrictions would be just simply ridiculous. And also, if this were to be imposed and then upheld, it would probably justify secession on Florida's part, because it would be a great limiter on their economy and lots of other scenarios where they're just going to have a lot of problems if the Biden administration goes through with that. Of course, DeSantis has said that they are going to respond swiftly if this sort of thing does get through. And that is the reasonable response, because obviously this is unconstitutional. Obviously it is unjust. It has no actual explanation, other than the fact that they are not following the particular dictates of so-called experts, who subsist on pseudoscience, by the way. As I think I've aptly explained in past videos, and I'm not going to go into today. It's simply ridiculous. I don't know what else to say about it. What else could you say about even the suggestion that we limit travel between particular states within the United States of America? What else could you say to that? I don't know what you could say to that, because it's just so ridiculous and just nonsensical and unjust, and all these sort of expletives I could use to explain the situation. Just on its face, it is all of those things. It's just simply almost to the point of evil at that point. It's just vindictive and just vile, awful. Man, I have so many words for that, but there's not a whole lot else to talk about, because it's just, I don't even know if there would be a discussion on this point, at least not one that would be particularly reasonable. There's not a whole lot else to say, I would say. And to move on to our last story, another scenario where I have a lot of expletives to talk about, where I have a lot of particularly vile words to say about this particular quote. The Democrat impeachment lead admits to using the National Guard to compel Trump into election concession. Now, this headline is a bit misleading, potentially. And to that point, I'm going to actually read out the quote from Ted Lieu, who is the person in reference in this headline. To quote him, Trump does not say the one sentence that matters. He does not say the one sentence that would stop future political violence. The election was not stolen. His words, not mine. He still has not said that sentence. That is why the National Guard troops in full body armor still patrol outside. Now, that particular sentence is really, really poisonous. And the reason I say this is because there are two simultaneous interpretations of this particular sentence, which are both equally valid, and depend entirely on how you perceive this perception. Now, I tend to agree with how this particular article is construing this particular quote. I do agree with it. However, there is a counter-interpretation, and I believe this counter-interpretation, not that it is inaccurate necessarily, but that this quote was carefully established to make this sort of thing possible. Because there is a question in this quote that is not said, however, it is obvious through its every word. And that is, why are the National Guards there in the first place? Because there are two potentially legitimate responses to that. It is either A, because there is a legitimate threat of political violence from the people, because Donald Trump cast doubt on the credibility of elections. Or two, it was put there cynically as a way to show strength, as a ridiculous show of strength after something that was completely overreacted to. What was called an insurrection, but was in all reality mostly a trespassing with slight vandalism, with a few deaths, mostly just one that was actually directly caused by the right, provably, the rest being either unconnected, or at least the connection has not been proven at this point. That includes the officer who was supposedly trampled to death. We don't actually know that. So far, the investigators involved have not found the video evidence of that, and the autopsy has not been released, where if, I'm just going to say this, if that had been evidence through the autopsy, they would have released it. So I'm just going to assume it's unproven, okay? But does it look like it's going to be proven? No, not really. So one death that was actually caused by the riot directly, and that was a death of a protester being shot in in all likelihood, unjustifiable circumstances. From the video evidence I have seen, I cannot justify that shooting, and so it seems to be an unjustified shooting, and that is the only death that is actually connected with this. And of course, there's other assaults and things going on which are bad. Obviously, that's bad, and the trespassing and the slight vandalism and stealing, also bad. All of those things are bad, obviously, and we are not yet at that point to justify it, and I don't. And my use of the word "yet" does not mean that I think it will happen. I just think it is possible that it would happen. But to be clear, we're not there yet. We're not there. We're just not there. We could be there. HR 1 exists. HR 127 exists, as I think I've already explained. Those two would actually justify this sort of thing, or at least go a long way to justifying it. But we're not there yet. And this quote is truly very insipid. Because he, I think, purposely laid out this quote to make it so that there are two legitimate interpretations to both bait people like the people who are writing this article and kind of me into talking about it and saying things which are not necessarily entirely accurate, or at least require an assumption or two. And then he can come back and say, well, okay, you made the wrong assumptions, you should have made these assumptions instead. But don't forget, both of the assumptions, either the assumption that the guards are there because of a legitimate threat, which I don't think is evidenced by anything that happened. Nothing happened on January 20th. There wasn't even any legitimate threat. No one even showed up. So I fail to see why they would be there for that reason. And the semi-permanent fencing does not make the claim that it would be a temporary threat, as this sort of thing, this sort of explanation would imply. And the other, both assumptions are equally legitimate, to be clear. The assumption that he is basing, that the National Guard is there because they're trying to force Trump to have a concession and concede and remove his political opinions from this, and the assumption that it's there because there's a legitimate threat caused by Trump, are both assumptions. They're both assumptions. They both exist as an extension of this sentence and this quote that do not actually, that are not actually contained in this quote. It's not a misrepresentation to characterize it as this article did, but I think the way it did it was kind of bad tactically. That's kind of my opinion on this article, because it doesn't even mention the other side of it, or at least, yeah, it doesn't mention the other side of it. It does not mention that this could be interpreted another way. And so there have been people who have been saying that it is being misinterpreted. I disagree. I say that both interpretations are equally likely and also equally valid, even if Ted Lieu comes out and endorses one or the other. Reason being is that within this particular quote, there is nothing to actually suggest either assumption is correct. And that's kind of the trap you fall into there, because it leads to a lot of potential problems. And this is something that Democrats have kind of gotten down to a science. It's been a very pernicious tactic they've used, where they have made statements that have these sorts of equally likely interpretations, one of which is completely insane, but also entirely in line with what they think, and one which is also kind of insane and not evidenced by reality, but is what they would want it to be. They make this sort of thing all the time, particularly these sort of high-level Democrats like Ted Lieu. But I think that's where I'm going to leave you guys off today. And wherever you are, if you got to the end of this video, subscribe. Subscribe for more. Unless you're on YouTube, subscribe anywhere else if you're on YouTube. I do not care about that website. It's completely worthless for content posting for politics, because you get algorithmically demoted. Other than that, subscribe to me on Minds, follow me on Gab, anywhere else I am. There's lots of links in the description. This has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and I'm out.